Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Knight Fellows research session of the IDeaS annual conference. This is a time for our graduate students to share the research that they've been working on under their Knight Fellowships under the Center for Informed Democracy and Social Cybersecurity. So we're happy to welcome them in and give them the ability to share their work and answer any questions. If you do have questions for a particular presentation, please drop it into the chat. If we have time, this is broken up into two sessions. So if we have some time kind of at the end, we might do a ability to unmute and ask. But in the meantime, go ahead and drop them into the chat and I can facilitate those. Our first presentation is Joshua Ehang with Network Dynamics of Online Hate. Josh, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I assume you can hear me. I think I've unmuted myself. So hello, everyone. Welcome to this series of Knight Fellow Talks. I'm very happy to kick us off with a presentation on the network dynamics of online hate. I'm a PhD student in societal computing at Carnegie Mellon University, and I'm studying online hate because it's a major problem in online communities around the world. If you were at the panel earlier, I think the speakers did a very good job of outlining just how important it is to think about it critically in very different contexts, including law, enterprises, and as scientists ourselves. So seminally, hate is defined as abusive language against a social group, and there have been major efforts to computationally detect it. So where my research tries to engage this body of work is by looking at the challenges of understanding hate as more than a linguistic phenomenon. In particular, hate is embedded in group dynamics, and it may be subject to inorganic manipulation. So the talk I'm presenting today revolves around 3 studies that I was able to do with support from the Knight Fellowship that tackles research questions around these issues. So the first study really was our attempt to ground our understanding of hate in social scientific theory and in a way that would cut across multiple data sets, multiple languages, and multiple platforms. And the specific theoretical framework that we worked with involved social identity theory and affect control theory. And we found basically that if you incorporate this theoretical understanding of hate as attacks against specific social groups, which we understand in terms of identity-based language, then you can find that across many different data sets of hate speech, the kind of text that's labeled as hate speech tends to consistently feature more abusive words as well as more identity words. And that helps us build more theoretically grounded models of hate speech. We also find that modeling hate in this way is able to cut across data sets in a generalizable way, such that if you project down all of these categories using identity-based features, you can see that all the hate classes across all the data sets essentially cluster together in one part of this low-dimensional space. And then you get these sub-hate categories, such as offensive language, abusive language, and spam on this next ring of labels. And then finally, all regular speech is furthest away from hate, with one category in particular called counter hate being the farthest away because it's speech that supposedly fights back against hate. So this essentially shows that studying hate from the perspective of social identities allows you to detect conceptually coherent hate classes and may be a good way to move forward in hate speech detection that is able to account for their wider social dynamics. And we try to push forward in this research direction by looking at how hate spreads in social networks. And in particular, the findings I want to share with you are that when we looked at how hate speech was spreading around the COVID-19 pandemic in both the United States and the Philippines, which are 2 very different national contexts, we found that the kinds of groups in social networks where we observed higher levels of hate speech tended to be smaller in size, lower in density. They tended to be more hierarchical and more isolated. So these shared structural features point to potential ways that groups may behave that could potentially lead to the higher spread of hate. And so seeing these similarities across contexts may help policymakers or platforms develop group-based ways to intervene. We also found that these same structures, even though they had similar structural features, they had different functions. In the US, we saw that the strongest association between hate during the COVID-19 pandemic was with racial identities, such as Asians and Chinese people, whereas in the Philippines, hate was directed towards failed political leaders. And then finally, I want to talk about how hate is spread by bots or information campaigns in general. Here we see actually a negative result, which is that if you look at the individual probability that an account is a bot, and then the probability that they're spreading hate, there's actually a very close to zero correlation, meaning hate speech and bots are not something that you can really find on an individual level. You're going to have, on the individual level, you're going to have bots that are not spreading hate. Maybe they're focused on fake news, or maybe they're just benign bots. And you're also going to have a lot of hateful humans. So individual level correlations are not the way to go when it comes to looking at the links between bots and hate. Instead, when you look at the groups in which there are high numbers of bots and high levels of hate, there's more hate in the denser clusters where bots are involved. There's more hate in more isolated clusters when bots are involved. And again, we're seeing comparable effects in both the US and the Philippines. So in ongoing and future work, I'm hoping to design unsupervised approaches that characterize bot-fueled hate campaigns in social networks worldwide. I also want to develop causal models so we're able to see over time whether there are causal impacts when bots are spreading hate or when certain identities become the targets of hate, and developing agent-based simulations that can test potential interventions. So I'm very grateful again for the support from the Knight Fellowship and from other funds. So thank you very much. I think that should be time for questions if there are any. Thank you.
I don't see any in the chat so far. Josh, though, if you could stay on for this first session, if there are questions for you that come up later, we can do that at the before the break.
All right. I'll stop sharing then. Thank you again for your time and attention. Looking forward to any discussion.
Okay. Next presentation is Corey Feclaris, developing a socio-cognitive stage model of cybersecurity behavior adoption.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I know, I was like waiting. I have like 3 different Zooms going on at the moment. Okay. Yes, I'm a 5th-year PhD candidate and a Knight Fellow. I'm also supported by the National Science Foundation, and I have a past career in journalism and IT and social media. I'm working on the problem of cyber defense adoption and non-adoption. I think computing systems are increasingly central to society, but many people do not understand enough about how they work or what cyber threats to guard against. Meanwhile, the global costs of cybercrime have jumped enormously in the last several years to over $1 trillion, as one company estimates. So my key insight is that to reduce costs and improve awareness, we should apply insights from areas outside of cybersecurity and computer science, chiefly social psychology, marketing, and public health. And so my work has gone along 3 different tracks to understand the security adoption process. So I've built up a body of work on what's called account sharing. And so this is a practice where people get around or work around the traditional default model of authentication for accounts, which is that one user corresponds to one account. People often contravene this and they'll share their passwords, even though this is generally frowned upon. And so we found that this is due not only to attitudes, but also collaboration motivations. such as wanting to share work with colleagues and also save money. My psychometric work has focused on creating measures of security attitudes. And so attitudes thinking about not only the cognitive, but also the emotional or the actual behaviors that we recollect engaging in. And so SA6, our one-factor scale, that measures a person's engagement and attentiveness to cybersecurity practices. And we found that that was strongly predictive not only of people's behavioral intention to engage in security practices, but then also their actual recollections that they had engaged in these practices within the past week, such as checking that their antivirus is up to date. And I've also done some work on theoretical modeling. So I've started investigating various models of cybersecurity behavior adoption from the viewpoint of an intellectual exercise. What if we adopted models from public health? And so now I'm engaged in some empirical investigation. I want to see whether, as with mask wearing and vaccinations, we can see that in different samples, we will also find that attitudes and social contexts are predictive of their cyber-protective behaviors. And now I've done some work to reanalyze my SA6 data set. My SA13 security attitude inventory is comprised of 4 different factors. And so I've broken SA6 into separate scales of attentiveness and engagement, and I've also developed 2 other scales of resistance and also concernedness to improve. And I see these as weighing in a person's cybersecurity decisional balance. And so these findings echo process or stage models in public health, such as the trans-theoretical model or the precaution adoption process model. And the stage approach has helped move people in towards health behaviors, such as quitting smoking and testing for radon at home. And so I see some promise for adapting these for cybersecurity or creating a new model from our empirical data. And so I think by identifying the causes and other associated concepts at each stage of the cyber defense adoption process, we can better match up interventions to the right target and, importantly, at the right time in that process. And so if we identify that somebody is resistant to certain security practices, maybe things like staying alert to fake news, maybe that's they're primed for an intervention where they would be prompted to reflect on the pros and cons of it changing their practices. If they're concerned to improve, but maybe they don't know how to go about it, maybe a simulation game such as a choose your own adventure might be a great intervention at that point. And so also somebody might be further along in the process, but stuck right at the point where they haven't actually adopted something. And so those people, they might be attentive. And so maybe they're primed for a 30-day trial or some sort of social nudge to get them over that hump. And of course, if somebody's already engaged in a number of security practices, we want to help them maintain those behaviors through maybe a rewards program, but also engaging in a help forum. So that can just help them troubleshoot some little issues that arise with these practices. And we're finding also that people like to educate others once they've adopted a practice. So my research question this summer is, what stages do people go through in the adoption or non-adoption of cybersecurity behaviors? And so to do this, I'm following a mixed methodology. And so in phase 1, I'm engaging in interviews. We're actually analyzing this data at the moment. We've sampled from a US-based population, 3 to 4 people who either scored low, middle, or high for engagement with security practices on a pre-screening questionnaire. And so we're identifying the stages that they're going through, but also the social influences that are relevant at each stage. We also see that threat perceptions are important, security attitudes, but also perceived tech characteristics. So say if somebody thinks that a certain practice is easy to use or is convenient, it's more likely that they'll adopt that practice versus if they see it as inconvenient or difficult to use. And then in phase 2, we'll use that model to develop a questionnaire. So for that, we'll do a more formal randomized sample or quota sampling that can match the US Census distribution by age, gender, and income. And so with that survey, we'll identify the distribution of these stages in the population. And we can correlate these with various social influences that people report, along with their demographics. We can also measure their cognitive factors and various experience factors, such as if they've frequently suffered security breaches in the past year. And then phase 3 will finalize that stage model. So we're looking for what is unique about cybersecurity as opposed to other behaviors that people have studied in the past. And so we can also look for similarities. 4 models that look promising from our data to look for comparisons are the health beliefs model, protection motivation theory, the trans theoretical model, and also a model called diffusion of innovations. And I've got the model below because I think according to our data, that might be the most similar to what we're seeing in our interview study. And so the outcomes will move the field of usable security away from one-size-fits-all strategies. We can create a classification algorithm so that people can direct resources and interventions, such as security tips or interface nudges, to those that are most likely to benefit. And this can really boost the effectiveness of cybersecurity risk assessments, especially if organizations are resource tight. Then you don't have to deliver security awareness training, say, to everybody, but maybe you can target certain modules to people who we see that are most primed to benefit from it. And also for those of us who study behavior adoption, this kind of a model can really help us sharpen our strategies when it comes to cybersecurity. And for industry research, this can help build business value in terms of being able to maximize sales or also to target marketing to those who are most likely to be receptive to it. So thank you very much for bearing with my technical difficulties at the beginning, and I'm happy to take any questions.
No questions in the chat so far, Corey. If you're able to remain on until the break when we stop recording, and then we can maybe allow people to unmute and ask questions if they have them then.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Next presentation is by Christine Leipert, Finding Low Credibility News Domains.
Hi, can you guys hear me and see my screen and face?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Christine Leipert, and as mentioned, I will be talking today about finding low credibility news domains. I am starting this fall going to be a 4th year PhD student, which is crazy to think how quickly time flies by, and I'm studying societal computing. I'm part of the IDeaS and CASO centers. So that's just a little bit of background on me, and I would also like to just start by saying I'm incredibly thankful for the funds provided through the Knight Fellowship to do research like this. But let's talk about the actual research now. So the problem, and if you're attending the sessions, you're very familiar with the fact that the vast majority of Americans get news from social media platforms like Facebook. And it's a growing concern that a lot of this news is not from a quality news source. Actually, 15% of the time when a user goes to a fake news site, they're coming in from a referral link from a Facebook post. So fake news and misinformation sites are really rampant on Facebook. And in the past year, we've seen an outbreak of something called pink slime, and these are fake regional news sources that pop up overnight. So instead of something like the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, they would be called like the Pittsburgh News Post. So they would have the regional name in it, and you would think that it's a valid news source because maybe it sounds similar enough to another news source that you trust. You don't think twice when you're going to the domain. But they are just fake news sites that someone propped up overnight that is not from that region. And since we know a number of low credibility news domains that have been categorized as fake news previously that are more long-term domains that have been around for a while. I was wondering, how can we quickly determine which of these news sites that are being shared on Facebook are reliable if they just came into existence in the past week? So the data that I used for this was Facebook data surrounding topics related to the 2020 US presidential elections last year. I used data from a tool called CrowdTangle. It's free software provided by Facebook. All academics are welcome to use it. And it's a great way for gathering data. So what I did was I searched for all of these terms that were mentioned in public Facebook pages, in addition to a link to a news article. So all these terms are related to the election and were mentioned in the post, but also in that post was a link outside to another news domain. So in terms of how I clean the data, I made sure to only include data from 2020. And something I added to the data set was flagging posts that went to fake news site domains. And I know that probably sounds a little bit arbitrary, but I referenced a 2019 article in the journal Science that listed out a number of fake news domains. So I used them as my base layer of knowing that a more long-term domain is a not reliable source of information. So this here is a visual I created using the data set in the software Aura. I looked at just this visual shows the commentary of the network around the term voter fraud in the data set. And all these red nodes are public Facebook pages, and the green nodes are the news articles that they link to. And you see some of the green nodes are a little bit more lit up like a Christmas tree, and a little bit larger. So I sized them, the larger ones, to coincide with the fake news sites that we know from that Science article. So seeing this built out, what kind of conclusions can we draw? And mathematically, how can we model that to say whether or not one of these domains is a fake news site? Well, what I did was I looked at, for each page that was sharing all these different links, what proportion of the links that they shared were categorized as fake news by Science journal. And if it was 9 out of 10, then that 10th article that we don't know about, the domain that maybe isn't on the fake news domain list, is given a 90% chance of being a fake news site. But then we do that in aggregate so that if that article was shared by someone who had all of their articles going out to non-fake news sites, that would be a 0. So we averaged it out. And at the end, we came up with a kind of a cutesy term for like a fake news score for all of these different domains. So what I learned from this is that there are some leading instances of low credibility news domains that aren't currently classified as such. So on the left side, this table shows the news domains that had more than 5 instances in the data set that had a higher average fake news score. So you see these ones have a lot of pink slime in it. You see this Washington Sentinel, South Africa Today, especially these ones that are mentioning regional areas that we should be concerned about. But on the flip side, if you're trying to look at this from a more positive perspective, we can also use this method to label safe news sites or ones that we shouldn't be as concerned about spreading misinformation moving forward. So still trying to pick where the cutoff is, or if we just want to present this as exclusively the probability of a domain being a fake news site moving forward. But I also have a number of future steps, because what research is ever fully complete. I'm currently working on automating the collection of these network links, as well as including data from Reddit and Twitter to see how these news articles of the low credibility scores fare in cross-platform communications. as well as incorporating a more sophisticated algorithm to assess the likelihood of a low credibility news site. But this is where we started, and I'm really excited to have this method of looking at new news sites that spring up and assessing them quickly and overnight. So I think I have some time for questions. I guess I'll hand it back to Jennifer.
One thing in the chat, Christine, can you share more why about the sites? Sorry, can you share more about why these sites are called pink slime?
It was actually just a news article that was listed as that, or sorry, a journal article that just coined the term pink slime that spread up during the 2020 presidential election. I can send you the article if you're interested though.
Yeah, maybe if you could dig it up and put the link in the chat, maybe.
Yeah.
And then if you can also hang around for Q&A before the break. We'll see if any questions come up then.
Fantastic. I'll be here with my camera off.
Thank you. So we're running just a little bit ahead of time, but we'll move on to the next presentation by Daniel Beluta. Comparing the behavioral effects of different interactions with sources of misinformation.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, hi everyone, I'm Daniel Beluta. I'll be talking about our research on trying to explore the behavioral effects of interacting with potential sources of misinformation on Twitter. So as many of you know, there has been a lot of research going into detecting and characterizing online influence campaigns, but there hasn't been nearly as much research going into actually quantifying the effects of interacting with this information on people's behaviors and beliefs. So the objective of our work has been to try to detect specific changes in user behavior after they interacted with a potential source of misinformation on Twitter. So the data we've been working with centers around more than 60 websites that claim to be news sources but are regarded as untrustworthy. And these websites, importantly, also control Twitter accounts. So we were interested in two types of Twitter users. First were users that were tweeting out links to these untrustworthy sites. And second were users that were replying to tweets sent out by the accounts controlled by these sites. And so for each of these two types of users, we collected 50 tweets from before we knew that they had interacted with the source of potential source of misinformation, and 50 tweets after that interaction. So once we had collected that data, we knew that we wanted to only analyze data from human Twitter users. So we used the bot hunter machine learning model developed in our group to get a bot probability score for each of these users and filter out the ones with a high score. And because this step in our processing could influence our results, we used two different thresholds in order to see how that affected the end results of the analysis. So here in the table, you can see that after filtering out the accounts that could have been bots, we were left with a relatively small sample of users to analyze. And so one of the things we're working on is collecting much more data. So once we had collected the data, we needed to find features that described these users' behaviors. So one of the first things that we did was we used NetMapper to extract some basic features about the contents of tweets. These were things like the number of swear words, the reading difficulty, the number of positive and negative emoji, those kinds of features. And then we were also interested in seeing whether these users became more hateful after interacting with a potential source of misinformation. So we used a model developed by Josh, who spoke earlier, that gives a probability that each tweet contains hate speech. And so we added that to our list of features. once we had all of these features calculated, we took a user's average feature value from before that user interacted with the source of misinformation and the average value afterwards. And we used manual in-use tests to see if there was a significant change in any of the feature values. Then beyond looking at how people were discussing things on Twitter, we were also interested in looking at what they were discussing. So namely the hashtags that they used, the other accounts that they mentioned, and the sites that they were linking to. So we, for example, for hashtags, what we did was we calculated the cosine similarity between a person's hashtag choices from the 15 tweets before the point of interaction and the 15 tweets after. And so that gave us a quantification of how much the user's hashtag choices changed across the point of interaction with the source of misinformation. And then in order to have some point of reference to compare to, we calculated the same cosine similarity using two different sets of 15 tweets each from before the interaction. So once we had those two similarity values, we used Wilcox and sign rank tests to see if there was a significant change in the hashtag choices or mentions or site links. So our results so far, we didn't find any significant change in any of the lexical features, and this was after we corrected for a false discovery rate of 5%. And then we also didn't see a significant change in the hate speech scores. We did find some significant changes for the tweet repliers, so the users that were replying to tweets sent out by these untrustworthy accounts. But that was only for hashtag choices and the accounts that they were mentioning, and it was only true for users that had bot scores below 40%. And even after all of these qualifications, the actual magnitude of the change was small. So as I said, by and large, we found little to no evidence of changes in user behavior after being exposed to these potential sources of misinformation. And also, as I mentioned previously, after filtering out the likely bots, we were left with not a large number of users to analyze. So one of the things that we're working on is collecting much more data. And even though this project seems to be adding to a growing body of evidence that kind of hints at misinformation not having huge direct effects on people's behaviors, at least one other work has proposed the idea that all of our discussions about misinformation and disinformation might actually be decreasing public confidence in democracy as an effective form of government. And so that might actually be the kind of worst consequence of misinformation. And so future work could take this idea into account as well. So that's it. I can take questions now if there are any.
No questions in the chat, Daniel. Oh, here's one from Josh. Wondering whether it might be analytically useful to re-include the bots identified by Bot Hunter, and they could be used as a set of controls.
I'm not, sorry, Josh, I'm not sure I understand how they would be controls. So one thing that we are looking into is comparing these kinds of users that are interacting with untrustworthy sources with users that are like sharing links to trustworthy news sites. So that's one thing we're thinking about doing, but I'm not sure how re-including the bots might help. And then, okay, yeah, I'll talk to you later. And there's another question.
Yep. Is there any way to test if longer term exposure to misinformation might bring about the changes you were looking for?
Yes, so it's possible that it's possible that the changes we're looking for might only show up over a longer period of time. I don't know if there's a reliable way of testing that with Twitter data, just because it's so hard to collect Twitter data on specific users over a long period of time. But I think with the new Twitter API and the new API policies, that might be possible. So the answer to your question is that I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Next presentation is Mansi Sood, Spread of Evolving Contagions over Multi-Layer Networks.
Hi, can you hear me? Is my audio fine?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Mansi. I'm a third year PhD student in the ECE department at Carnegie Mellon University. And today I'm going to talk about my work on epidemic spreading of evolving contagions over multi-layer networks. And I thank the Knight Foundation for supporting this work through the Knight Fellowship. Sorry. So spreading processes allow us to model the spread of an infectious disease over the network of susceptible individuals, the spread of information over a social network. And through this framework, we can try to understand conditions that lead to epidemic outbreaks in the case of infectious diseases, or that lead to a news story becoming viral. And we can also quantify how big is the outbreak, in the sense what fraction of the population eventually acquires the information or the infection. So throughout this talk, I'll be using some ideas from network epidemics to try to develop a theory that can answer some of the questions that arise in spreading of contagions that have several strains and that spread on several layers of the network. And I'll briefly make this more precise. And throughout, when I talk about a contagion in the context of a social network, think of it as a piece of information that can be acquired when two people communicate with each other. And this is sort of inspired from the idea of people getting infected when they come in contact in the spread of infectious diseases. Sorry, I'm having some trouble with sharing my slides. Just a second. I'll just reshare this, sorry for the technical difficulties. Yes, sorry about that. I'll try to. Yeah, just a moment. Okay. Hopefully this won't freeze like the. All right. And then one thing that I want to highlight is when we're studying the spread of contagions, it's important to account for the fact that not all information might have the same rates of transmission. And in particular, there can be several variants of an information which can have different rates of transmission. Moreover, social networks typically, there are different platforms available and individuals can participate in different social networks. And therefore, it is important to incorporate both the different variants that can appear for the contagion as well as different layers that can be there in the social network. And again, this is inspired from the field of network epidemics, where there are pathogens which have different strains, and consequently, they can have different rates of transmission. And similarly, because of the way human beings interact and participate in different social settings, there can be different risks of transmissions associated with different congregate settings. So sort of our work tries to build up an abstract model that can be applied to study both of these contexts. And an overview of epidemiological models that are used to study spreading processes. There are two broad approaches. The first approach assumes homogeneous mixing, where it is assumed that any individual in the network can infect any other individual. And on the other hand, there's network epidemics, which accounts for the contact structure over which human beings interact, and information can only be transmitted, or infections can be spread only when two individuals interact. And for contagion evolution, depending on whether or not we allow the contagion to evolve and change its transmissibility during the course of transmission, there can be models that study single strain spreading or multi-strain spreading. And multi-strain spreading account for mutations in the pathogen, and we'll be focusing on this. And in the case of information, it allows us to incorporate changes in the information as it is propagated forward. And in this context, so far studies have only focused on a single layer network where all links have same chances of transmission. And we'll focus on a multi-layer setting in which we can have different transmissibilities associated with different types of interactions that can happen. And in particular, for the network model, we use a multi-layer configuration model, and we'll allow each individual to independently be a member of different layers. And then the overall network model is a union of these networks. And we allow the likelihood of transmission of a piece of information from one individual to another individual to depend both on the type of network as well as the type of the variant or strain of the information or the pathogen. And I'll now briefly describe the transmission model. The spreading process starts when a single seed node is infected or acquires the news item. And then this seed node independently infects all their neighbors with chances that depend on the type of links that they use to interact with their neighbors. And after an individual has acquired the contagion, there can be mutations. And in particular, the information or the contagion can mutate to another strain, which can have different transmissibility. And this process continues until no further infections are possible. And for this multi-strain spreading model on a multi-layer contact network, we characterize the epidemic characteristics. So we say there's an epidemic or an information cascade when, in the limit of a large network size, there's a positive fraction of individuals who are infected or receive the contagion. And otherwise, we call the outbreaks self-limited. And so far, our main contributions have been, so for this multi-strain spreading model on a multi-layer network, so far we have derived the probability of emergence, which is the chances that a contagion, when introduced in a population, will result in an epidemic or an information cascade, affecting a sizable portion of the population. And if so, what is its epidemic size, and under what conditions on the network transmission mutation parameters do we see epidemics or information cascades? And we also synthesize synthetic networks and simulate the multi-strain spreading on these networks. And we saw that our theoretical predictions were able to accurately predict both the probability of emergence of epidemics or information cascades, as well as the size of these outbreaks. And to summarize, the goal of this specific research project is to understand how multi-strain contagion spread over multi-layer contact networks. And future work here includes, so far we have derived the analytical results that characterize the epidemic, and as part of future work, we want to understand how different intervention policies affect the contact network structure, and how can we limit the spread of infection on different layers, or in the case of information, how can we what networks topologies lead to the most significant impact on the disease outbreak, and we want to supplement our analysis with real world network data. And thanks for listening to the talk. I'll be happy to take any questions, and I apologize for the technical issues in the talk.
I don't see any questions in the chat yet, Nancy. Oh, here's one from Josh. Quick clarifying question. In the transmission process, can two agents be connected by multiple kinds of links, e.g. friends on Twitter and Facebook? And does that affect how infection happens?
Thanks, that's an excellent question. So yes, there can be different types of links, as well as different types of variants of information that an individual gets. So far in the model, we assume that co-infection is not possible, and the individual will end up acquiring just one piece of the information, but we do allow for there to be multiple exposures through different networks, and then we have probabilities associated by the fraction of sort of edges for each network. And yeah, I'll be happy to discuss this in detail, but there is some room for modeling this in our framework so far, but yeah, we don't assume co-infection.
Thanks, Nancy. I think
Thanks.
we can move to our next presentation by Isabel Murdoch. Multi-platform analysis of the 2020 US election fraud and protest posts.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Monsi, for helping set up the multi-layer framework that I'm going to be focusing on. So hi, my name is Isabel Murdoch. I just finished my first year in the ECE department at CMU, and my work is on multi-platform analysis of 2020 US election fraud and protest posts. If you were here for my morning presentation, you can take a break for a few minutes because this is basically just a shortened version of that talk. Okay, so why do a multi-platform analysis? We know that the social media landscape is diverse. According to Pew, we know that American adults use a variety of different platforms and oftentimes use multiple platforms. And each of these platforms offer different social structures or ways to connect with other people, different ways to make posts, as well as different recommendation systems and ways that they target users with content. And so when users are a part of multiple platforms, they effectively connect as pathways for information to spread between the platforms. And so this drives a need to understand how information spreads both within the individual platforms as well as between them. And so to do this work, I focused on 3 platforms: Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit. And in particular, I look at the 2020 US presidential election and specifically posts relating to election fraud and election protests. So I collected posts that were made between October 1st, 2020 and January 19th, 2021. You can see the filter terms that I used to collect my posts on the left for the fraud and protest categories. And overall, a lot of posts were collected. It was mainly from Twitter, but also a substantial number from Facebook and Reddit. And these posts included a lot of different URLs as well, which will be useful later on. Okay, so just comparing the platforms individually, we see if we look at posting activity that peaks in posts corresponded with major election outcomes and events. That kind of makes sense, right? For the fraud data set on the left, we see a major spike in activity around November 6th and 7th. This makes sense because November 6th was the day that Pennsylvania and Georgia's election results flipped from having Trump in the lead to having President Biden in the lead. And so, you know, people might turn to fraud as an explanation for that occurrence. For the protest data set, we see a major spike of posts on November 14th and 15th. Again, this makes sense because November 14th was the day of the Million MAGA March in DC. And then again, we see a spike on the 6th that coincides with the attack on the US Capitol. And from these plots, we see that generally Reddit lagged about a day behind Twitter and Facebook in terms of activity. And so this could indicate that while Twitter and Facebook might have been used to post about the events or coordinate the events ahead of time and during the events, Reddit might have been used afterward to discuss what had happened or people's opinions on it and things like that. Moving on to look at the length of these posts, we see that tweets contain the fewest words. This is pretty obvious since Twitter has a strict character limit, and Facebook posts tended to contain the most. In general, across all of the platforms, fraud-related posts tended to be longer than protest-related ones. And we see that also Facebook posts contain the most URLs on average, followed by Reddit, so they kind of had the same behavior as the post lengths themselves. As well, we saw that fraud posts on Facebook had more net positive reactions than protest ones, and the opposite was true for Reddit. Okay, so pulling out now the URL content that we found in these posts, we see that social media was the most popular or the most posted type of URL content, followed by news. The breakdown was a little bit different by platform, which you can see in the chart on the left, but in general, that was the relationship. We also saw that social media URLs were more common in protest posts, while news URLs were more common in fraud posts. And then when we took out the news URLs and classified the domains into left and right leaning, we saw that Reddit and Twitter were more left biased in news content versus Facebook, which was more right biased in its news content. Okay, so that was like comparing the platforms. Now, if we look at the cross-platform spread of information, we see that there was significant linking across platforms. In particular, Facebook had the largest amount of cross-linking, and it linked to a lot of tweets, but Reddit also linked to quite a few tweets, and Twitter linked to a lot of Facebook posts too. In general, Reddit's content wasn't really linked to as much on the other platforms. Zooming out a little bit, we also see that there is significant linking to other social media platforms. In particular, we see a lot of linking to Parler and Instagram, as well as TikTok and Gab. And these included like censorship citing calls to move to other platforms, links to protest information and organizing, as well as citing news or evidence claims for election fraud on the other platforms. And there was over 59,000 URLs that appeared on multiple platforms. So this could include those social media posts, as well as like news or videos type of links. And we see again, the strongest relationship is between Twitter and Facebook, although there's still a good relationship between Twitter and Reddit as well. Overall, there was about 8,000 URLs that were shared on all three platforms. This was mostly news URLs, followed by social media. However, the social media URLs were more likely to be posted multiple times over and over than the news articles were. Some initial analysis of looking at kind of when these URLs tended to appear on platforms first and last, we see that they tended to appear on Twitter first and Reddit last. Again, if we look at just URLs that appeared within a quick time frame, so if they first appeared on two platforms within a minute, we see that this kind of behavior was stronger on URLs on Twitter and Facebook than Twitter and Reddit or Facebook and Reddit. And again, even if we take it to be within a day, so the URLs appeared on both platforms within a day of each other, again, Twitter and Facebook URLs were more likely to fall into that category than the ones involving Reddit. So just a conclusion and future steps. So as an overview, I looked at how the platforms had different posting and content characteristics, as well as patterns in cross-platform spread. One kind of big limitation on this is that, especially for Facebook, I'm only looking at public data that's available with CrowdTangle, so it's a little bit more popular content as well. And so all of the spread that happened on the private side or in smaller groups and pages isn't included in this analysis. And for next steps, I'm working on identifying intentional cross-platform spread versus kind of natural spread or linking to posts on other platforms. And that's kind of a comparison that I want to do moving forward. And then the goal of all of this is to develop a multi-platform agent-based model that I can use to simulate misinformation spread across the different platform layers and test out countermeasures in general. So thank you for listening, and thank you for the Knight Fellowship, and this is my information if you want to reach out. Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks, Isabel. There is one in the chat. I wonder if some of the time patterns are because of the social sharing tools used, as I don't think I can share simultaneously to Reddit as I can to Twitter and Facebook. Does your data include the platforms used to post the URLs? For example, if it's direct versus if it's coming from Sprout Social or Buffer.
That's a great point. I'm working on right now. So right now, most of my analysis is based on that like 1 minute time frame. So if the URLs appeared within the same minute, I'm expanding it out to look at URLs that appeared within the same hour of each other, which should hopefully help with that, like being automated posting to multiple platforms versus individually trying to spread like post on each platform one at a time. But yeah, I agree that that's a good point and could definitely impact the results.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So our next presentation is Catherine King, investigating why individuals share misinformation on social media. Catherine unfortunately can't be with us this afternoon, so I'm going to share a video of her presentation.
Sharing it. Hi everyone, my name is Catherine King and I'm a second year PhD student in societal computing and my advisor is Dr. Kathleen Carley. Today I'll be talking about my Knight project, which is investigating why individuals share misinformation on social media. So I have 3 primary research questions. The first is, who is sharing misinformation on social media and why are they sharing it? The second is, how do these individuals react when they later realize that they have posted an inaccurate story online? And finally, can understanding these first 2 questions help us determine potentially effective countermeasures? So when going through these research questions, I did some background research. And what I found is that voters have been seeing more and more misinformation and disinformation on social media over the last few years. Misinformation has been seen across the political spectrum from both foreign and domestic agents trying to spread division or trying to favor certain candidates over other candidates. And research has also found that bots do a disproportionate amount of the spreading of misinformation on social media. And these false and misleading stories really have, many negative effects. So the first is that society has become more polarized in the US over the last few decades. So the average Democratic congressperson versus the average Republican congressperson, they're significantly further apart than they were 25 years ago. Additionally, there's growing distrust by the public in both institutions and the mainstream media. So it's possible, besides the polarization and distrust, that misinformation could have other negative effects. So the first could be an increased propensity for political violence, as we saw on January 6th, at the Capitol riots, and it could also potentially affect political or public policy outcomes. So next, I looked at some relevant surveys in this area to see what has been done already in the literature and try to build off of their work. So what I found is that most people claim to care about accuracy, and they may just be lazy, as in they're not really thinking about what they're posting. Maybe their friend sent it to them, or they didn't read the whole article before forwarding it on their Twitter feed. And a study found that when people are primed to be thinking of accuracy in advance of choosing whether or not to post something, they're actually less likely to say that they would share a false headline than individuals who are not primed to think about accuracy in advance. So even just thinking about it can help stop the spread of misinformation. But I'm curious what happens after someone has already posted something that's not true. So these previous surveys look at preventing people posting false and misleading content, but what happens afterwards? So, first, is it even possible to change individuals' minds? People often double down on their beliefs when confronted with opposing information. Individuals could be embarrassed. But if they do change their mind, what do they do, and what's an effective intervention? Do these individuals delete their posts? Do they correct their posts? And these are really what I'm looking at in my project. So here's just a very high level survey design for this project. So first, I'm screening for Americans who are active social media users and often post either news or political content. Then I'll be asking demographic questions for controls in the study. And then I'll be grouping everyone into two groups. So in the first group, they'll be asked relevant questions on this topic. For example, have any of your social media contacts posted something false or misleading? And what if anything, did you say to them? And then they'll be asked more of an action. So they'll be shown false and true headlines and ask if they would post them or not. And then if they chose to post something inaccurate, ask them what they would do once they find out it was inaccurate. And then I'll also be asking these two sets of questions in reverse order, because asking the topic questions first might prime people to be thinking about accuracy. So it's possible in group one, they would be sharing fewer false posts. And just in general, I'm continuing finalizing the survey questions and need to get IRB approval. In my next steps, I will pre-test the survey, administer the survey on a platform like Mechanical Turk, and analyze the results. And I welcome feedback from anyone who has survey design experience. This is the first survey I have designed. Thank you. And here is a slide with my references for this project.
Sorry for the video audio sync there. I think the audio is a bit ahead of the video. At this point, I'm going to stop recording